There's a particular kind of quiet that falls over a room when a senior officer realizes, in real time, in front of an audience, that he's just insulted someone considerably more accomplished than himself. I've heard this story described by 3 different people who were standing close enough to watch it happen, and every single one of them, independently, used almost the exact same word to describe that quiet. Frozen. A full colonel, standing in front of a room of visiting officers, made a joke about a woman's worn, faded flight jacket, the kind of casual, condescending joke that's designed to get an easy laugh at someone else's expense. And then he saw what was stitched beneath her collar, mostly hidden, easy to miss unless you were looking closely, and every single word he'd planned to say next simply evaporated. If you love stories about arrogance running headfirst into something it never bothered to actually look for, hit subscribe before we go any further, because that's genuinely the whole engine behind this channel. And tonight, I want to play a little game with you. Somewhere in this story, before I actually describe what was on that patch, you're going to start guessing. When you feel it land, stop and put your guess in the comments. I want to know exactly where in the story it clicked for you. Let's rewind to the beginning of that morning, because you need to feel exactly how confident that colonel was before we get anywhere near her collar. Her name, for tonight's story, was Lieutenant Colonel Grace Halloran, 44 years old, and she'd arrived that day for a joint inter-service briefing, the kind of event that brings together officers from different branches and different commands to coordinate on a shared operational planning exercise. It's the sort of gathering where appearances matter more than most people would like to admit, where a certain unspoken uniform of crispness and polish tends to signal, rightly or wrongly, who belongs in the room and who might not quite fit the picture. Grace showed up in a flight jacket that had clearly seen real years of use, faded in places, a little worn at the cuffs, the kind of wear that doesn't come from sitting in a closet, but from actually being flown in, repeatedly, across a career considerably longer and considerably more demanding than a fresh, unmarked jacket could ever suggest. To most people in that room, a detail like that wouldn't have registered as anything worth commenting on at all. To the colonel running that morning's briefing, a man named Colonel Whitman Boyce, it apparently registered as an opening. I want to be fair to the moment before I tell you what happened, because I think it matters to understanding exactly how these things unfold. Boyce wasn't some outright villain looking to humiliate anyone. He was, by most accounts from people who'd worked with him over the years, a man who liked being the sharpest, quickest voice in any room he walked into, someone who used humor, often at someone else's expense, as a way of establishing exactly where he stood in a given hierarchy before anyone else got the chance to establish it for him. It's a fairly common instinct in rooms full of senior officers, honestly, and it usually costs nothing, because most of the time, the person on the receiving end simply absorbs it and the room moves on. That morning, as officers filed into the briefing room and took their seats, Boyce, standing near the front making the kind of easy small talk that fills the minutes before an official start time, glanced toward Grace as she came in, looked her over for a beat and said, loud enough for a good portion of the room to hear clearly, "Somebody didn't get the memo about dress standards for this one. That jacket's seen better decades." A ripple of laughter followed, the specific, easy kind that happens when a senior officer makes a joke and everyone in the room understands instinctively that laughing along is the safer choice. Grace, according to 2 witnesses who were watching closely, didn't flinch, didn't flush, didn't do anything at all beyond offer the kind of small, polite smile you give someone whose joke landed somewhere far short of actually funny. She said nothing in response, just took her seat, calm and unbothered, the way someone does when they've heard a version of this particular joke more times in their career than they could easily count, and stopped finding it interesting a long time ago. Here's something I want you sitting with while we keep going tonight, because I think it matters more than it sounds like it should right now. How many times do you think people mistake wear and age for a lack of value, when really, wear is often just proof of exactly how much use something has genuinely earned? Hold that thought. We're circling back to it very soon. What Boyce didn't know, because he'd never bothered to actually look closely enough to find out, was that Grace Halloran's career included more than 2 decades of operational flying experience across some of the most demanding assignments her branch offered, the kind of career that doesn't announce itself through a crisp, unworn uniform, because the people who actually live careers like that one spend most of their time in the field, not in front of a mirror. That particular jacket, the one Boyce had just publicly mocked, wasn't simply old. It was the exact jacket she'd worn during a stretch of her career considerably more significant than anyone in that room had any reason to suspect. A period spent flying alongside a highly specialized joint task force, conducting operations that, for reasons entirely outside her control, remained largely undiscussed even years afterward. The specific kind of history that exists quietly in a service record without ever making its way into casual conversation at a briefing table. And beneath the collar of that same jacket, stitched into the lining in a place most people would never think to look, sat a small, unofficial patch, the kind that isn't issued through any standard supply channel, the kind that gets given, quietly, by a specific unit to a specific person, as a mark of something considerably more personal than rank or assignment. It represented her service with that same specialized task force, a group whose actual work, whose actual missions, remained known in real detail to only a small, tightly bound circle of people who'd served alongside her, but whose reputation, among the people who did understand it, carried a very particular kind of weight. Grace had never once, in years of inter-service briefings and joint exercises, made a point of showing that patch to anyone. It wasn't hidden out of secrecy exactly, not in any dramatic sense. It was simply hers, tucked somewhere private, the kind of thing you carry quietly rather than display, because some parts of a career aren't really meant to be worn on the outside for a room full of strangers to notice and comment on. The briefing that morning proceeded largely as planned, technical, detailed, exactly the kind of coordination meeting these events usually are, and Grace, for the first stretch of it, contributed exactly the way any competent officer would, answering when asked, offering input when relevant, giving nobody in that room any particular reason to revise the impression Boyce's joke had left hanging in the air. About 40 minutes in, the discussion turned to a specific operational scenario, a complex coordination challenge involving exactly the kind of multi-unit tactical planning that Grace's specialized background had spent years preparing her to handle at a level considerably beyond what most people in that room, Boyce included, had ever personally worked through. And when the conversation reached a point where the room, collectively, seemed to be circling a problem without quite landing on the right answer, Grace spoke up, clearly, precisely, laying out a solution built on details and operational nuance that made unmistakably clear to anyone actually listening closely that she wasn't offering a textbook answer. She was offering an answer built from first-hand experience with exactly this kind of scenario, the specific, hard-won knowledge that only comes from having actually lived through something similar rather than simply studying it. The room went quiet for a beat, the specific quiet of people recalculating, in real time, exactly how much they'd underestimated the person who'd just spoken. Boyce, according to one witness, asked, with a little more edge in his voice than before, exactly what gave her that particular insight, a question that carried just enough skepticism in its tone to suggest he still hadn't quite caught up to what the rest of the room was starting to sense. Grace answered plainly, without any particular emphasis, simply stating that she'd served with a specialized task force earlier in her career, the kind of vague, appropriately discreet answer that people with genuinely sensitive service histories learn to give. An answer that told the room enough to understand something significant sat behind it, without revealing anything that wasn't hers to share in that setting. It was in the pause that followed, according to two witnesses, that Boyce, still processing what he'd just heard, glanced toward her more carefully than he had all morning. And it was in that closer look that he noticed, for the first time, the edge of that small, unofficial patch, just visible beneath her collar, where it had shifted slightly as she'd leaned forward to speak. I want you to really picture this moment with me, because according to everyone who described it afterward, it happened almost in slow motion. Boyce's expression, confident and a little smug just moments earlier, shifted through something like recognition, and then, unmistakably, through something considerably closer to genuine discomfort. Because that patch, small and unofficial as it was, meant something very specific to anyone who'd spent enough time around that particular corner of the military to actually recognize it, and Boyce, as it turned out, had spent exactly enough time in exactly that world to know precisely what he was looking at. According to one witness sitting close enough to see clearly, Boyce didn't say anything for several long seconds, and when he finally did speak, his voice had lost every trace of the easy, joking confidence it had carried at the start of the morning. He asked her, directly and considerably more carefully than his earlier question, to confirm what he thought he was seeing. Grace, calm as she'd been through the entire morning, simply confirmed it, plainly, without embellishment, the same understated tone she'd used for everything else she'd said in that room. The silence that followed, according to every account I've come across, was the specific kind of silence that happens when an entire room simultaneously reconstructs everything they thought they understood about a person in the space of about 4 seconds. Officers who'd laughed along with Boyce's joke less than an hour earlier were now looking at Grace with an entirely different kind of attention, the specific, respectful attention reserved for people whose actual history has just quietly, undeniably outpaced whatever assumption the room had built about them. Boyce, to his credit, according to two witnesses, didn't try to bluster past the moment or pretend it hadn't happened. He acknowledged it directly, in front of the entire room, telling Grace plainly that he owed her an apology for the comment he'd made at the start of the briefing, and that he clearly had no idea what he'd actually been looking at when he made it. Grace accepted the apology with the same understated grace she'd carried through the entire morning, telling him, according to one witness, that it wasn't the first time someone had made assumptions based on a worn jacket, and it probably wouldn't be the last, but that she appreciated him saying so plainly in front of the room rather than letting it pass unaddressed. The rest of that briefing, according to everyone who described it afterward, proceeded with a noticeably different tone, Grace's input carrying a weight and attentiveness that had been entirely absent in how the room had treated her at the start of the morning. Officers who'd barely acknowledged her walking in were, by the end of the session, actively seeking her perspective on nearly every complex point the discussion touched. Word of what had happened in that briefing room spread, as these things tend to, considerably faster and considerably further than anyone involved probably expected. Within the base's broader network of officers who'd heard some version of the story secondhand, it became, for a stretch of weeks afterward, the specific kind of cautionary tale senior officers occasionally tell each other, gently, as a reminder about exactly how much a worn jacket can actually be hiding if you never bother to look past it. Boyce, for his part, according to people who worked with him in the months that followed, became noticeably more careful about that particular brand of easy at someone else's expense humor, a shift several of his colleagues noted with a mixture of quiet approval and gentle amusement. He never fully lived the moment down, in the sense that it became one of those stories retold, carefully and respectfully, for years afterward. But by most accounts, he absorbed the lesson the way you'd hope someone in his position would, as a genuinely useful, if uncomfortable, reminder about the gap between what someone looks like on the surface and what they've actually done to earn the wear on their jacket. What stays with me most about this story isn't really the 4 seconds it took for that patch to completely rewrite the room's understanding of her, satisfying as that moment undeniably is. It's everything underneath it. A career spent, quietly and without fanfare, doing work considerably more demanding and considerably more significant than a casual glance across a briefing room could ever hope to convey. Grace never once tried to correct the assumption directly. She let a joke pass, absorbed it with grace that, frankly, most people wouldn't have managed as easily as she did, and simply continued being exactly who she'd always been, right up until the moment the room finally, unavoidably, caught up to it. So here's my question for you tonight, and I want your honest answer in the comments. Do you think Boyce deserves real credit for how directly and immediately he apologized once he understood what he'd actually said? Or do you think the joke itself, regardless of the apology that followed it, reflects something worth sitting with a little longer than a single moment of embarrassment can fix? And tell me the other thing too. Before I actually described what was on that patch, had you already started guessing that her worn jacket was hiding something considerably more significant than anyone in that room realized? If this story kept you here tonight, subscribe before you go, because this channel exists entirely for exactly this kind of story. The quiet ones, the underestimated ones, the ones whose worn jackets and unassuming presence turn out to be carrying considerably more than anyone bothered to notice at first glance. And if you've got a story like Grace's, something you've lived through or heard that reminds you of this one, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. I'll see you in the next one.